Hello and welcome back to the I&D podcast. I'm your host, Dennis Donicic. Now, our main story today is going to focus on potential sanctions on Ukraine. And we're going to explain these sanctions, what they potentially could be, and what impact they can have. But before we get started with our main story today, I want to address a couple comments from our video yesterday, which focused on the situation as a whole and why we got here, and more specifically, the geopolitical nature of the conflict between NATO and Russia. Now, one gentleman, Vyacheslav Prebek, stated that Poland was never a Russian republic. Very true. I also never stated that Poland was a Russian republic. What I did state, however, is that Poland was within the Russian sphere of influence, more specifically, the Eastern Bloc Warsaw Pact. And I was recently in Warsaw, very beautiful city, very amazing people, and great food. Wonderful place to sign a treaty, which is actually where the Warsaw Pact was created. Now, while Poland was never a direct republic of the Soviet Union, just like every other Warsaw Pact country in the Eastern Bloc, it was heavily influenced by the foreign policy of Russia and did not have any foreign policy of its own. Essentially, it was a de facto protectorate state, or officially a satellite state of the Soviet Union from 1947 to 1989. Now, the next comment that I want to address comes from Adeki Oko. And Adeki, I hope you're well. I actually went to undergraduate university with Adeki at Arizona State. I hope he's doing great. We spent quite a good amount of time together back in uni. And Adeki pointed something out that is really interesting, and I did not manage to point out or even think about when I was making the video yesterday, or as I've been looking at the situation in Ukraine, or the tensions over Ukraine between the US and Russia. Why has Russia decided to raise tensions today? As Adeki pointed out, the timing seems relatively bad. It would have been more intelligent for Russia to wait 5 to 10 years and continue its campaigns of destabilizing Western governments through information campaigns, through funding populist movements, through assisting people that generally destabilize countries internally. That maybe this could have worked better in 5 to 10 years, and then NATO would have been in a much weaker position while Russia would have been in a much more powerful one. Now, that is actually really a good point, and it's true. If Russia continues a successful disinformation campaign, Western countries and NATO would become significantly less powerful. And as Adeki pointed out before, tensions grew in Ukraine. The popularity of NATO was decreasing amongst the general population. Now the vast majority of Ukrainians actually want to join NATO because they feel that their territorial integrity is in danger. But when the danger wasn't there, they felt no need for NATO. But the thing is, Russia's timing is very interesting. Now, my theory is, and no one can know this for certain, but it comes at a time where inflation has been affecting the whole world, particularly Europe. Now, it's also been affecting the United States, but it feels much more painful in most European countries. And energy prices specifically, so oil and natural gas, which heats the vast majority of Europe, have become significantly more expensive. Russia is the main provider of oil and natural gas for most European countries. The reality is these tensions come at a time where economic sanctions, which is what our main story is going to focus on today, would be very costly for Europe to introduce against Russia. It would significantly increase the cost of energy sources in Europe and could fundamentally become extremely painful for the citizenry of what are democratically elected leaderships and democratic nations. Russia actually has a very good vantage point here. In addition to this, in 5 to 10 years, Russia's biggest source of power is its production of energy. And it's dirty energy, natural gas, oil, coal, etc. The reality is in 5 to 10 years, renewable energy will be more advanced. We don't know where we're going to be in 5 years. We don't know where we're going to be in 10 years, but it will. And many countries will be significantly less reliant upon old school or orthodox energy, such as oil or natural gas. In fact, the reason that most climate change and renewable energy resource campaigns and pushes come from European countries is not because they're left-wing liberals that want to dance around in the Paris with the trees. The reality is these acts and these proposals are pushed by European countries because they want the world to have renewable energy and not be dependent on Russia. A world that has renewable energy is significantly less dependent on Russia. But that is another topic for another day. Now that we have addressed the comments that I wanted to, we're going to get right into our main story today, which are potential United States sanctions against Russia. Potential US and NATO partner alliance state sanctions against Russia if there is an invasion on Ukraine. Now, it has been very clear and made publicly clear by the United States and the leadership of other NATO alliance members that if Russia commits to any form of invasion of the territorial integrity of Ukraine, sanctions unlike anything the world has ever seen before will be introduced upon Russia. But when asked for specific types of proposals or what sanctions would be introduced, no solid answer can be given. Only general proposals. And the leaders of NATO and the Joe Biden administration have stated that this is done to keep Putin guessing. That is bullshit. Here's the thing. Vladimir Putin, or more specifically the Russian leadership and the Russian Federation, should actually clearly know what awaits them if they choose to convict or commit to an invasion of Ukraine. The reality is once an invasion of Ukraine is committed on any form of its territory, the Russian soldiers there are not going to leave, no matter the level of sanctions. So maybe it should be a little bit more clear of what exactly will happen. The reason nothing has been publicly stated is in reality because European nations that are part of NATO and the United States cannot agree on a unified sanctions pact. And it has been problematic. European countries that are part of NATO are significantly, as I mentioned in responding to Adeki Oko's comment, are dependent on Russian energy imports. And they're also more dependent on the Russian economy than the United States is. Now, they're not fully dependent on the Russian economy, but they interact with it on a regular basis. And any form of difficult sanctions affect both parties, not just the one being sanctioned. It affects the one committing to the sanctions. And if the one committing to the sanctions is going to face more economic penalties than its other partners, obviously, it's going to be a little bit more restrictive or a little bit more repressed and not want to actually fully commit to these sanctions. Now, some sanctions have been proposed. The most drastic, and what would effectively be the most effective form of sanction, would be to ban Russia from what is the international banking SWIFT system. Now, the international financial system of SWIFT is a system that connects bank to bank to bank across national lines that allows large financial transactions to occur between different countries. Now, if Russia were to be excluded from the SWIFT financial system, it would be extremely damaging to Russia's economy. Keep in mind that 40% of economic revenue produced last year alone by Russia came from foreign energy sales. Now, not all of this 40% of payments, 40% of foreign energy sales, the payments were made via SWIFT, but a significant portion probably were. And cutting Russia off from the SWIFT system would hurt it, like any other country, dramatically. And the SWIFT financial system has actually been persuaded to remove countries before in a series of sanctions by the United States, particularly Iran, which was removed from the SWIFT system because of its nuclear program, and it's still not a member of SWIFT. Now, the problem with these sanctions is it would be extremely costly to the United States and to Germany as well as the other European partners of the NATO alliance. But particularly Germany, which is a key ally member of NATO and is going to be absolutely crucial when the United States begins introducing actual sanctions if an invasion of Ukraine is made. Now, the reason that Germany is apprehensive for introducing any form of SWIFT restrictions on Russia is because it would massively impact the German economy. A lot of financial transactions occur between Germany and between Russia, between both parties. And when these sanctions are committed to, one is cutting itself off from the other. It's not just a one-sided sword, it's a double-edged one that affects both parties. And obviously, Germans who buy a significant portion of their foreign oil and gas will be apprehensive to introduce this SWIFT system. In fact, German Foreign Minister, the German Minister of Foreign Affairs stated that sometimes the toughest stick is not the most intelligent sword. Now, I'm going to assume that this is just a very badly translated German metaphor, but it makes a lot of sense. Well, this is the strongest and most powerful option in terms of sanctions that can be taken. It's the most drastic, and it can be viewed as the nuclear option that essentially shuts off any form of financial interaction with Russia on both sides. This will be painful for any economy that is entering these sanctions. Russia is not Iran. Russia is one of the world's largest economies, even though it's not what it used to be before compared to other countries that have risen on the scene, such as China. Russia still maintains a very relevant spot on the geopolitical and global financial market, especially regarding Western Europe and energy sales. Excluding Russia from the SWIFT system will be an extremely painful measure on both sides. Now, this measure was actually proposed back in 2014 after Russia had invaded and annexed Crimea in Ukraine. However, it was never introduced because it was so drastic. Now, European leaders were heavily criticized, and US leadership was heavily criticized for not introducing these very rigorous sanctions. And in the meantime, Russia has attempted to invent its own answer to SWIFT and its own method of international financial transactions, though those attempts have not been successful. So, while this would be the most effective method that would have the most amount of damage to Russia's economy, both short-term and long-term, it would also impact the NATO allies. So what other options exist? One that is also drastic, but could actually much more easily be committed to, is Russia being denied from dollar clearance. Now, the United States can do this on its own without any commitment from its allies. Even if they protest, the US can still do this completely on its own without any foreign influence. And the reason why is because the United States actually inherently holds one of the world's most powerful financial tools and instruments, and that is the US dollar. The US dollar is used for the vast majority of foreign exchanges and any type of foreign transactions that occurs between two currencies. Now, anytime that these kinds of transactions occur, they have to be cleared and approved and processed by either the US Federal Reserve or another American banking institution. And if there is a blockade on Russia to not allow dollar clearance in the Federal Reserve and other US financial institutions, Russia will not be able to trade with the US dollar whatsoever. This would be effective, and it would massively have a negative impact on Russia's economy. And even if Russia did attempt to find other currencies to do exchanges or trades with, it would still be difficult. Because today, let's say if you want to exchange Polish zloty to Japanese yen, in many cases, when you're exchanging the zloty, it is first exchanged to the United States dollar and then to the yen. Now, there obviously are other foreign currencies that have a strong international presence and that are used in foreign exchange, such as the euro. Obviously, a currency clearance blockade on Russia would be extremely effective, especially if the European Union would dedicate to do the same thing with the euro. It would have a huge impact on Russia's economy, and it would be one that is united. Now, another option that has not just been suggested, but has already been carried out by the Joe Biden administration in 2021 are bond restrictions. Now, basically what this would be is restricting investors within the domestic country. So in this case, United States investors and any other European country that commits to these sanctions, restricting their investors from buying Russian government bonds. Now, a government bond is basically a financial instrument that allows governments to take out credit in the form of investments to investors. They take out a bond, the investor pays for the bond, and the government promises to return the bond money with a relative amount of interest. Now, these investments are not as profitable as other more traditional financial market investments, but they are very stable. Now, last year, the Joe Biden administration, because of another troop buildup along the borders of Ukraine within Russia, actually instituted a ban on U.S. investors against buying Russian government bonds directly from Russian government institutions. But bonds are a very interesting financial tool because they can not only be sold by actual government institutions, there are also secondary markets that purchase and resell bonds. And there has not been have not been any restrictions on purchasing these bonds themselves. Now, it is only logical that the Biden administration is going to follow through and restrict the purchase of any form of Russian bonds on even the secondary market. And probably, because it's not too hard of a restriction to make, most other European allies in NATO will follow through on this. Now, another contested and probably the most controversial aspect of sanctions against Russia has been one particular piece of infrastructure. The Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline, which, as the name suggests, is a natural gas pipeline. But this gas pipeline is special. It flows through Russia, from Russia, through Ukraine and the rest of Europe into Germany. And what this does is it allows Russia to sell its natural gas more easily, and it allows Germany and other European countries to buy this natural gas at a cheaper price. Now, the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline has actually been a controversial issue even before the tensions increased in Ukraine, or the potential invasion of Ukraine by Russia was even a suggestion or a thought in anyone's mind. Many people recognize the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline not as a means of being able to more easily transport natural gas and for Russia to more easily be able to sell it and for Germany to get cheaper gas and Europe to get cheaper gas. Many people view this as a Russian method to increase its leverage in the region, politically and militarily speaking. Now, the United States Congress, not the administration of Joe Biden, but the Congress, both the Republicans and the Democrats have separate bills which basically propose the same thing with one key difference. Now, both of these bills in the U.S. Congress have proposed that sanctions be introduced against the operators of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. Now, I want to point out that the pipeline itself is owned by a subsidiary of Gazprom, and Gazprom is Russia's largest gas company. It is also completely state-owned. So the Russian government essentially owns the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. However, multiple different operators in multiple different regions and countries operate the pipeline itself. And the U.S. Congress is proposing to introduce American sanctions against these operators, which would heavily disincentivize them from continuing to operate this pipeline. Now, the only difference between the Republican and Democratic legislation is that Republicans want to immediately, now, today, yesterday, introduce these sanctions against the operators of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, while Democrats want to introduce sanctions, but not yet, only if Russia invades Ukraine. However, from a bipartisan perspective, at least they agree on something, that this pipeline is a massive tool of Russia enacting its foreign policy interests in Europe. Now, Germany, even though it originally allowed the construction of this pipeline and allowed for it to come into its nation, has stated that if Ukraine is invaded, it will, at least it's on the table, that it could potentially block the pipeline itself. Now, this would make the receiving of natural gas much more difficult for Germany, but I think that the Germans finally realize that cheaper and faster natural gas comes at other costs when it's coming from Russia. Now, the final form of sanctions that is being introduced are probably the most, or being proposed, but definitely will happen, are the most insignificant, but they're the most interesting. And these are sanctions against the leadership and the elite of Russia. The United States particularly is proposing, and I want to point out now, not once has the US levied sanctions against any country without levying particular individual sanctions against the leaders of that nation. So in every country that the United States has committed sanctions to, this includes Cuba, Syria, North Korea, Sudan, Russian Crimea, etc., the leaders of these nations and these regions have been sanctioned themselves. And what has been proposed have been sanctions against Vladimir Putin himself, his family, and an alleged mistress, Alina Kabeva, who was actually a former Olympic gold medalist. Don't get too excited. She won gold in 2004 and has aged significantly since then. But nonetheless, the United States government has proposed introducing sanctions on these particular individuals, in addition to introducing sanctions against leaders of the oligarchy. So people in Russia that hold Russia's gas companies, people that hold Russia's largest private investments, people that hold banks, people that run the military, etc. Basically sanctions across the entire board of Russia's elite to make them hurt and to make them put pressure on Vladimir Putin to withdraw from Ukraine if there is an invasion. Now, these are likely scenarios of potential sanctions that can be introduced. Nothing has been formally committed to yet. Negotiations are still occurring between the United States and its European allies to see what kind of sanctions it will actually introduce collectively. But we can assume that something similar to what has been outlined just now by myself will be undertaken in the event that Ukraine is invaded by Russia. And before I end the report, I don't want to be accused of alarmism. I want to acknowledge the fact that the Ukrainian government today has went on an extensive campaign in an attempt to calm the international community. Multiple times, officials from the Ukrainian government, including its president and prime minister, have stated that a Russian invasion is not imminent. The Minister of Defense said that you can sleep calmly at night and that there's no reason to pack your bags. To foreign diplomats inside Ukraine, saying that there is no imminent danger of invasion from Russia. However, the leadership of Ukraine has recognized the long-term threat that Russia poses to its country. And I want to actually go back to what I mentioned yesterday. This could potentially just be a Russian attempt at brinkmanship. Keep in mind that Russia has stated that it will remove its soldiers from the borders of Ukraine if NATO permanently bans the entry of Ukraine into the organization, and if NATO stops operating in former Soviet satellite states that are now in the NATO alliance. However, NATO has stated, and the United States has stated, that this is not an option and that they will not negotiate this whatsoever. We're going to see how this situation develops. Ukrainian politicians and officials are stating that for now, it's calm and that invasion is not imminent. But soldiers on both sides are continuing to be built up. At the very least, today we highlighted what kind of potential sanctions could be introduced if an invasion occurs. So let me know what you think. I have two main questions for you, and let me know in the comments. Do you think Russia will actually invade Ukraine? And finally, do you think sanctions are an effective method of carrying out foreign policy and achieving one's national interest? Thanks for tuning in. Like, comment, and subscribe. I'll see you guys next time.